Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on compliance in environmental health and safety audits. My name is Allison Carlson, and I am Bureau Veritas's North America Training Specialist. Let's go ahead and get started. Do you want to go over a couple of things here about what we do at Bureau Veritas? Bureau Veritas is a world leader in inspection and certification services. Created in 1828, the group has approximately 82,000 employees, located in more than 1,600 offices and laboratories across the globe. Bureau Veritas helps its clients improve their performance by offering services and innovative solutions in order to ensure their assets, products, infrastructure, and processes meet standards and regulation in terms of quality, health and safety, environmental protection, and social responsibility. Bureau Veritas is a business-to-business society service company that contributes to positively transforming the world we live in. We work closely with our clients to address the crucial challenges they face to link these two emerging aspirations of society. We work with companies to build and protect their reputations, support them as they forge the foundation of trust that is built to last. And two things I really want to hone in on here is our inspection and certification side. Our inspections involve an on-site verification that products, services, assets, and facilities meet specification and operate as intended. They cover a wide range of services designed to control quality, verify quantities, and meet regulatory requirements. Our inspection services help companies have confidence in the reliability and integrity of their products, assets, and systems. And on our certification side, as an independent third party and accredited certification body, we provide a certification service to attest that management systems, services, and personnel comply with specific standards. Equipment and products can be certified to meet sector-specific or industry standards, international, local, or voluntary standards, or manufacture of client requirements. Certification enables companies to access new markets, strengthen their brands, and simply obtain license to operate. A few things here with our housekeeping. Organizers will keep microphones and cameras off for the entire webinar. Any questions, please use the Q&A chat box. I do have it set up, so if you don't want people knowing who you are, you can do that anonymously. And if you did not get your questions answered during the Q&A, we'll definitely have our speaker reach out to you via email later on. And the webinar will be recorded. The recordings and slides will be shared with all parties that have registered by email on Thursday. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Bobby Satishan. He is Bureau Veritas' Senior Project Manager for certification in North America. Bobby leads audits across the globe, multi-site QHSE contracts, and supports auditor development programs. Bobby has a background in engineering and business. He brings a strong technical expertise and industry knowledge across automotive, oil and gas, constructions, and manufacturing sectors. I could go on and on about all of his accomplishments and accolades, but we'd be here the entire time of this webinar. So Bobby, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll get into it.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Allison, for that.
You're welcome.
Just make sure I'm audible, and just want to make sure that it's fine, right? Okay.
Yes.
I'll just go ahead and share my slides here. Right. Right. The screen, I probably might need to duplicate the view. Yeah, I think we are all set here. So, thank you, Allison. Once again, the topic for the webinar here is going to be compliance in environmental and health and safety management system audits. Just before we begin, a bit of a disclaimer here. The first thing being that the webinar here is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or interpretive guidance on regulatory requirements. Laws and regulations, they change extremely frequently, and always do verify that the versions referred to are from official sources, and those would be the current versions. Legal frameworks, they tend to vary extremely, again, between jurisdictions and also between counties, states, provinces, and or federal levels. Auditors, in general, they are not legal experts. They may be, but in general, they're not legal experts. Their role in an audit is limited to assessing the effectiveness or conformance of a process of a client organization for determining and evaluating its compliance obligations. With the disclaimer out of the way, let's take a look at the various topics that we have lined up in this webinar. So we'll start off with a quick introduction. We'll move on to legal structures, regulatory frameworks. We will then touch upon the compliance aspects within the environmental and health and safety management systems. And finally, we will have a quick recap. Module 1, Introduction. The objectives for the webinar here is to review the term compliance. Compliance, you would know, has various interpretations in both the ISO 14001 for environmental and the ISO 45001 management system standard for health and safety. We need to get a little bit of clarification on the boundaries and focus on this of this webinar, just because of the fact that compliance is a very broad term. So we will discuss that. And the third point here would be what role does an auditor play in the compliance evaluation process? And with that, we will look at also what an organization's requirements are or expectations are in external audits. So let's start with the various shades of meaning of the term compliance. Let's begin with the ISO 14001 or the environmental management system. So the legal requirements, one of the things that the 14001 standard, one of the ways that the 14001 standard defines the term compliance is that legal requirements that an organization has to comply with and other requirements that an organization has to or chooses to comply with. So what does this mean in a practical sense, right? So compliance in an environmental management system could be a combination of applicable laws and regulations, which is the often understood term. There could be voluntary environmental commitments that an organization chooses to comply with, various organizational and industry standards that may be specific to the sector that the organization is operating in, contractual relationships with various stakeholders, both internal and external to the organization, and there could be arrangements and agreements with community groups or NGOs. However, again, if you were going to talk about all of these, probably 1 hour is certainly not enough. So the reason we are going to be focusing on just the applicable laws and regulations is because that comprises the majority of the compliance obligations for any organization. The ones that are highlighted in light blue, that are non-probably laws or regulations, these could be evaluated by an organization as part of their internal audit processes. So with that being said, let's look at what the 45001 or the health and safety management system talks about compliance. As you can see, it reads very, very similar legal requirements that an organization has to comply with and other requirements that an organization has to or chooses to comply with. Again, compliance in OHSMS, which is the Health and Safety Management System standard, includes applicable laws and regulations, which again becomes the focus of this webinar, and other requirements like provisions that are provided in collective agreements, determining the roles of worker representatives that could be legally mandated or through the organization's own requirements, or again, through union agreements. So the first point here is probably a very common misconception, when it comes to management system audits. One of the things that I phase personally, even during audits, is to define, is to make sure that the expectations are clear. So the role of an auditor, again, like I said, auditors may not be in general legal experts. So within any management system standard, the role of an auditor is to assess conformance. A management systems audit is a conformance audit. It's not a legal compliance audit. So what does an auditor look for? They look for processes that an organization has in place, right? Essentially as a question, like, does the organization have process in place for identifying compliance requirements? Does the organization have process in place for periodically evaluating the degree of compliance? So two things: identification and evaluation. You first identify what are necessary for the organization, and then you proceed to evaluate the degree to which you have complied with those requirements that you have identified. Again, from this slide onwards, going forward, I would use these terms compliance and legal requirements interchangeably for the purposes of uh, for clarity within the context of this webinar. Let's move on to legal structures and regulatory frameworks. Now, just because of the fact that various jurisdictions, be it in the US, Canada, UK, because the constitutional frameworks would vary between these jurisdictions, there's often a possibility that the regulatory framework might not be exactly reflective of what is shown here. But in general, through experience, what I've seen is that between the US, whereas in Canada, okay, take UK, New Zealand, Australia, in general, there is an act which serves as the first level document. You can think of it like a policy. Policies will have overarching guidelines on various laws as it is applicable to certain sectors or certain activities of an organization. Regulations are level 2 documents. Regulations would be independent, or they may be a part of an act. Whether it's an act or a regulation, these are enforceable by regulatory bodies and they hold up in a court of law. For this very reason, organizations must ensure that they have a very, very good understanding of both acts and regulations. There are various sources to obtain these. We will look at how we can go about developing such frameworks in further slides. But it's extremely important to know that acts and regulations must be very strictly identified and complied with. Guidelines and codes of practice. There are various interpretations for this term in various jurisdictions. They are sometimes considered to be best practices. And something from an auditor perspective is that we look for areas where certain codes of practices might be adopted into law. For example, the fire code, or let's take the building code. There are level 3, these are level 3 documents, they're codes, but they may have been adopted into law. So as an auditor, some of the things that we look for is that the organization has mechanisms in place to identify what acts are applicable to its nature of operations, its regulations, and codes of practice. And this is essentially a framework that you can adopt, you can replicate generally between various jurisdictions. Just to give you an example in terms of what we looked at, in the US, you have something called the Code of Federal Regulations, right? An official and comprehensive compilation of the various rules and regulations issued by federal agencies. There are 50 titles within the Code of Federal Regulations. From an EHS perspective, the ones that an auditor mostly would be concerned with are Title 29, which concerns with the occupational health and safety management system, Title 40, protection of the environment, as the name suggests, the environmental management system, and Title 49, the Department of Transportation. Again, it has elements that are going to be impacting your environmental management system. And of course, there are others as well, but this is one area of focus. Again, to show you how the level ones tie into the level twos, just an example from Title 40 I've just provided here. So you have a program, let's say the Spill Prevention Control and Countermeasure Program, the SPCC. It has an overarching act to it, the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act would have these overarching policies there. The SPCC document is going to help you meet those requirements of that act at a more, and of course, those regulations will explain the requirements at a more granular level. Similarly, for hazardous waste handling, you have the identification and listing of hazardous waste falling under, in general, under the RECRA Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Now, it's extremely important to know here that compliance obligations might also be sector specific. There are certain sectors where there are certain specific requirements just applicable to that sector. Let's take the marine sector here. The ISPS code, or the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, is something that's applicable to the marine sector, among other requirements like the Marine Labor Convention, the MLC, or we can say the ISM, the International Safety Management. So as an auditor, when we are there at the facility and we're looking at applicable laws and regulations, we are also looking at obligations that are relevant to the specific sector that you are operating in. So as an organization, it's important, as we looked at in the first slide, to have a good understanding of the compliance obligations that are applicable to you and also those sector specific requirements. Now, this is where we come to the crux of this webinar. So compliance obligations frameworks within the ISO 14001 and the ISO 45001 standards are very similar. They exist under similar clauses, which makes it easier from an integration point of view for organizations that are certified to both the 14001 and the 45001 standards. The first clause that we need to know about is clause 6.1.3. 613 is where you identify the clause requirement. 613 requires organizations to identify or determine what compliance obligations. Again, we are only exploring the legal portions here at this webinar or at any audit. We will look at the compliance obligations that are applicable to the processes that you have. So this section requires auditors to verify if the organization has mechanisms in place to adequately identify being the key word there, legal requirements associated with its nature of operations. 912 talks about the degree of compliance. So you have identified, and now you're looking at what mechanisms you have to periodically evaluate if they are in compliance with the legal requirements identified under 6.1.3. This portion is extremely important here. The last few words here, under 912, it says that the legal requirements that you have identified under 613, which by extension means that if you have not identified a legal requirement, there is a fair chance that you would not have a mechanism in place to periodically evaluate it. So this is why 6.1.3 sets the foundation of compliance with these two interlinked clauses. Let's look at this. And when I say let's look at this jointly, I would like to tell you this from an auditor's viewpoint. So to begin with, 613, where you determine compliance obligations, organizations need to have a clear understanding of the scope of their operations. In the context of 45001, this could be an identification of all the process and human interactions in terms of the nature of work. 14,001 specifically calls out the need for organizations to use something called a life cycle perspective approach. So, under this life cycle perspective, you're looking at what are the different processes that affect my organization. You're looking at the interrelationships between the process using a cradle to grave concept. And most importantly, you need to consider both core and support process. One of the reasons why a lot of organizations tend to have gaps in their management systems when it comes to 613 is because not all processes, both core and support process, are considered when setting up the management system to identify those compliance obligations. One good starting point, again, there could be various approaches that organizations can adopt here. One possible starting point is to have a 50K process flow map, something at a very high level, where you can see the general interactions of the process. And then you can break it down further at a 5K level, where you are looking at those interactions within the process itself. So the starting point here, in order to ensure that you have a good process flow map, you need to have the scope defined by the organization. So once you have the scope defined, once you have your process flow maps in place, you have kind of got to a good spot where you can now start documenting what are the different level 1, level 2, or level 3 acts, regulations, or codes of practice applicable to your organization. Now, what's extremely important to note here is that 613 requires, for both standards, requires organizations to maintain documented information on the identified compliance obligations. How do we do it? Let's explore further with an example. Let's take an aluminum melting furnace. One of the ways that you can approach this exercise is you can identify the various health and safety regulations. Now, this is just from a health and safety perspective. I'm going to start. So, what are the various hazards? Burns, you can entrapment in the machine, pinch hazards. All of those can be listed down, either as hazards or as activities, listed down to identify the specific regulation that deals with that hazard or the activity or that condition there, and the corresponding act. One of the ways that you can ensure that you have not missed out a certain obligation is by doing a very thorough risk assessment or a job safety analysis. Again, it's extremely important. The ISO 45001 standard requires the participation, the consultation and participation of the people who are most closely associated with doing the job in doing risk assessments and job safety analysis. So it has to have this collaborative approach. You could always involve third parties and others in the process of helping you identify regulations, but the best people to do it are always the people who are closest to the actual activity taking place. This will help to ensure that no legal obligations are missed out, and therefore process hazard risk assessments or job safety analysis would also be excellent starting points to cross-reference and determine all legal obligations. And from an auditing perspective, auditors use a similar approach. Again, process flow maps may not be warranted in terms of a standard requirement, documented ones. It's always good to have one just to ensure that you have all the bases covered when you go in to determine your compliance obligations. Let's look at the environmental regulation side now. Some of the aspects with an aluminum furnace could be emissions to air, hazardous waste generation, stormwater discharges. Again, you can see that I have captured the regulations and the corresponding act. I have to mention here that this table is not all inclusive. It's just for indicative purposes. So again, start off from the process flow map, identify all the different core and support activities that link to that function. And again, a good starting point in case of environmental regulations would be your aspect impact register, which again, as per the standard requirements, needs the organization to use a life cycle perspective. If you had noticed in the previous slides, I had just marked those federal level requirements. Um, Again, as I mentioned on the first slide, there could be federal, state, county, city requirements. There could be requirements at various levels. And those requirements would also be structured in a very similar way to the level 1, 2, 3, where there are acts, there are regulations, and codes of practice. An example I've provided here is from the state of California. The act is the California Occupational Health and Safety Act, the regulatory agency being the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, and the regulation itself being Title 8 of CCR, or the California Code of Regulations. It can be sometimes, one thing to note here is that the state requirements can oftentimes be more stringent than the federal requirements. So automatically, if you comply with the state codes, you would be by default complying with the federal level codes as well. As an auditor, we look at all those levels. So again, as an organization, it's important to review your process, look at those different levels for both the federal, state, and of course, other applicable county or city requirements. Auditing considerations. So how does this all translate in practice? When it comes to 613, this is where an organization has determined its compliance obligations. From a health and safety point of view, auditors generally would be asking for process flow maps, hazard risk assessments, job safety analysis reports, legal registers, and review of active permits. From an environmental perspective, these could be process flow maps, aspect impact register, of course, including both core and support process, the legal register, review of active permits, and again, the organization's EPA category if it's within the US jurisdiction, the EPA generator category. Um, it's important to note that all of these documents may not be applicable for all audits. It could be very well just the process flow maps, and that becomes a starting point. As an organization, it's very important to have consistency between the documents. Internal consistency is one of the reasons why organizations tend to receive non-conformances against 613. The job safety analysis might identify certain hazards. The same hazards may not be captured within your legal register. These are the kind of non-conformances that usually auditors come across. The process flow maps might identify a certain process or a certain support process. The support process might not show up in the hazard risk register. It might not show up in the legal register. So internal consistency between the various documentation is extremely important within the requirements of 613. With that being said, let's look at how it all flows into 912. Now, 912 is where an organization is trying to determine the mechanisms it has in place to periodically evaluate if it continues to remain in compliance with its identified legal regulations. So you have identified, and now you are trying to determine how far do you meet the requirements of a certain act or regulation or a code of practice. So let's talk about permits. Oftentimes we come across permits. Having a permit in place is not a guarantee of compliance, but certainly a valid permit there satisfies the 613 requirement because you have identified probably releases to air to be one of your aspects of your process, and you have obtained a air pollution control permit, something to that effect. However, that is not going to help with 912. 912 is where you would have to start looking into those permit conditions. So every permit will have certain conditions that allows or does not allow, you to do certain things. So those could include sampling requirements, like probably could be grab sampling versus composite sampling. Where do you sample from? The requirements for legal sampling points, reporting thresholds, or it could even have training requirements. From an auditor's perspective, within 912, we are looking at those permit conditions. So as an organization, you have determined your compliance obligation, you have identified what permits are applicable to it. Under 912, you have to go through those conditions individually and make sure that you are within the envelope, the regulatory frame, thresholds when it comes to those conditions. Of course, whether you track the expiry or renewals, and again, both the 14,001 and the 45,001 standards require documented information of the evaluation of compliance results. And this is again very important, because 912, some of the non-conformances that we come across in 912 is because certain permit conditions might not have been fulfilled or not have been followed. So essentially, this is how auditors view the 912 requirements. And let's, within 912, you can break it down into two parts. There would be a documentation review and there would be an on-site evaluation. Some of those documentation review elements would be for health and safety management system, mandatory posters, facility PPE inspection checklist, machinery inspection checklist, condition monitoring reports, permit to work documentation, load tests. It could be load tests for the slings, for the chains. These are the documents that we are looking at. And that is the documentation review stage of it. Let's look at it from an environmental perspective. There could be SWIP plans, there could be SPCC control programs, tier 2 reporting forms, hazardous waste manifest. Again, in this, under 912, auditors are scanning for permit conditions, reporting dates, and those kinds of considerations. Once the documentation review is complete, we would then move to the on-site review. So let's look at the health and safety part of it. So you have called out something in the form, in one of your forms, and you have checked it off. Under health and safety management system audits, we are looking for consistency between the forms and the actual controls. These could be machine guarding, chemical storage. As you can see here, lockout, tagout, procedures are being followed, confined space confined space entry procedures, and the like. So this is the on-site review phase of an audit. Similarly, for environmental management systems, these could be storage areas, labeling requirements, secondary containment, and of course, there are a lot more that are not captured here. Organizations have various means to stay on top of both the requirements of 613, where you need to identify, and 912, where you need to evaluate. Some of them are in the form of softwares. Some common softwares have been listed here that we come across. These could be SAI 360, Enablon, Velocity, EHS, Sphera. You can also use compliance checklists. Sometimes these regulatory agencies like OSHA, EPA, etc., they provide compliance checklists, ready-made packages. You can use that, tailor it to meet your organization's activities. Some people go in for SharePoint, Google Drives. There could also be just spreadsheets, for an organization that's relatively less complex in its operations and processes. periodic audits, which could be your internal audits, self-assessment reports. Again, it's important to note that some of these requirements might be directly mandated as well. Just to give you an example, ISPS requires self-assessment to be carried out as a part of one of its requirements. So there you go. Those would also feed into becoming a mechanism to evaluate compliance. Again, regulatory bodies and industry association subscriptions and memberships. And of course, there's always the third-party consultants who can also assess your process management systems and provide you with frameworks with which you can work. So some of those methods that I've mentioned there are just going to help you comply with 613, which is the identification of your compliance requirements. Whereas some of them, just like a simple form, could help you meet both the identification and the evaluation pieces of it. So you have a machinery inspection checklist. Of course, to inspect something, you have also identified. So this is, you can, organizations are free. The standard does not specify a certain requirement of certain tool to be used. Organizations can use what suits best for their nature of operations and complexity. And of course, you're not constrained to using any one method. You can use multiple methods to manage your compliance obligations. And there are organizations that might use different methods within even the same department and just between different functions. To summarize, as a part of pre-audit planning, so pre-audit planning is where everything starts. The auditor gets in touch with the client, usually 45 to 60 days before the audit is set to officially commence. And that's where the auditors are reviewing, sometimes jointly with the client, the legal structure of the jurisdiction within which the organization operates. During the audit, initially a documentation review is carried out to evaluate the organization's mechanisms to identify its compliance obligations with clause 613, which is basically talking about identification. And then we move on to the documentation review to evaluate the organization's mechanisms to evaluate its degree of compliance with clause 912. After the documentation review is complete, we would move on to the on-site assessment. Now, very important to note that it might not always be this way. There could be different, some of these steps might be in different order, but this is one possible direction that that auditors would choose to do. Followed site assessment to validate the effectiveness of the mechanisms to evaluate the degree of compliance. Extremely important to note again, need to recap this, is that the management system audit that's being conducted are not legal compliance audits. Legal compliance audits are usually done by the organizations themselves. Of course, the auditors would look at a relevant sample of information to assess if the organization has mechanisms to both determine its obligations and also to evaluate the degree or extent of compliance. And this can be demonstrated effectively in the field or on the production floor. You're aware it is, we come in with a range of training modules. And of course, some of the assessment services that we offer are also in identifying compliance obligations for organizations, auditing through our auditing division. So we offer a range of different services when it comes to compliance assessments. And I've also included a few resources here for we would be handing out these webinar slides after the conclusion of this webinar. So you can always go through some of these links, just some indicative links here. But of course, just wanted to reiterate that a lot of the information is out there on the internet. Just what's most important is to use a very structured approach when it comes to both identifying and determining the evaluation of compliance. With that, I would like to conclude the webinar and hand it off to Alison here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bobby. That was wonderful. So now we're going to go ahead and go on to our question and answer portion of the webinar. So please, if you'd like to go ahead and put some questions into the chat or into the Q&A box, that would be great. But Bobby, we're going to go off here. Our first question is going to be: do you think that my organization maybe benefit from special compliance focused audits by Bureau Veritas?
Yep. So we do have various compliance auditing services that we provide as a part of our assessments. We have received some very good feedback from customers when it comes to helping them identify potential gaps in determining those areas of compliance. And we usually set these up as special audits, and these could be remote or on site, depending on how the client organization wishes to do.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next one is: have you considered using large learning module platforms to identify the various compliance obligations relevant to the industry or my employer?
Yes, large learning modules. This is very interesting, just because of the fact that there is a massive burst of various kinds of AI platforms, and that also becomes a very good starting point. In fact, again, it's important to do the due diligence to make sure that what is being the output of a prompt is indeed accurate and consistent with the current regulatory framework. So yeah, I mean, that's a great starting point. LLMs do help identify aspects, impacts, and hazardous risks. So yeah.
Okay, and then one more here. Do you believe that external compliance focused trainings can benefit your organization? If so, what would the expectation of such a training?
Right. Compliance trainings certainly would help. I mean, again, not everyone are very familiar with how the regulatory frameworks operate. Not everyone within an organization. Perhaps it's often handed over to the legal department to do that.
Mhm.
It's often good for organizations to train their people on identifying those compliance obligations, at least within their direct activity that they do. And again, more aware the people are, the more solid the system would be.
Okay, great. There a lot of our people here today, they're asking a lot of questions, so I'm just going to keep rolling with this, okay? If a company has a system for identifying legal requirements and respective monitoring and review, but does not meet several legal requirements, is this, in your view, compliant?
Right. So, Azan, if I just understood that question correctly, so the organization here does have various requirements that they have identified, but they have missed out a few, is it?
Yes, they're not all there, but just a few. Mhm.
Okay. So usually the impact of that. So at an audit, usually the way that is treated is that the impact of those missed um, requirements would be assessed, and that assessment would usually be manifesting in the form of a minor or a major non-conformance, depending on the impact on the management system. There have been cases where organizations have missed out certain support processes that do not play a big role in its in its compliance process. So yeah, in such cases, it's probably a minor non-conformance, and organizations have gone ahead and fixed it, assessed it, addressed it.
Okay. It says, do you have any requirements to SW used for documentation? Any need for validation?
Yeah. So software within documentation is always helpful. Especially, we have seen a lot of different kinds of off-the-shelf softwares being used. Some of them which we captured in our training here itself. Again, it depends on the complexity and size of the organization, the complexity of the process, not a requirement from the standard. You can use a simple spreadsheet to stay on top of all the different compliance obligations. Sometimes what we have seen is that using softwares will help you make sure that you have those repetitive tasks completed in a more effective manner.
Okay. All right, our next question is, we have identified applicable legal and other requirements, but currently a couple are not under compliance. However, we have an action plan to ensure compliance in the near future. Will that be considered a non-compliant or a non-conformance?
Okay, that is a very, very, very good question. It's a very interesting question, in fact. So something that I receive quite often as well. So in this specific scenario, we are mostly looking at clause 10.2, not really 6.1.3 or 9.1.2. 10.2 essentially deals with non-conformance management. So in this case, the client has identified that there is a gap and they have put in place corrective actions to address that gap. In this case, it does not become a non-conformance at an external audit, which means that you have the mechanisms necessary to have certain action plans. Now, of course, there is a area where those action plans have not been completed. That becomes a different issue then altogether. But just from that question, that is not treated as generally as a non-conformance.
Okay, great. And we do have one more question, but I think I can answer this one. It says, do you have any or looking for a good resource to develop risk evaluation process? Can you share any links or offer future training sessions for us? I could do the training session. We do have a lot of internal and lead auditor courses that are coming up. But for resources, I believe we will be sharing that last slide that's very interactive that I think will be a great tool. I don't know, Bobby, if you can, I don't know how the tools on there, that's your expertise.
Oh yeah. No, we can certainly, those are direct links again, but we have various resources that we can work jointly with the training function, and we can structure very focused training programs for certain industries as well, especially sector-specific trainings.
Yeah. And then to keep going along this same path here, we are actually offering 50% off on our lead 45,001 lead auditor course. It is next week, but we never run 50% off. I'm going to drop the link for that here. I just shared it in the Q&A if anybody wants to look into that. The discount code as well is ISO 50%. You can definitely put that in and at checkout, and that will give you that discount. So I can give you more information on that as well. We do have one question though that he's asking to, or this person is asking to ask, not over our chat, but verbally. So I'm going to go ahead and allow him to ask that here. Give me 1 second. And if I can figure that out. It may not let me. Yeah, it's not letting me. That person, I'll reach out to you, see what we can do about getting that question answered. I know it's very important. We want to make sure we reach every single person, and Bobby, I'll also CC you in that email. But this will conclude our webinar for today. Once again, I wanted to thank Bobby. This was wonderful. We could tell you were excited of this topic, so I do appreciate it. And thank you all for being here and logging in today. Have a great one.